They came from the borderlands, men shaped by exposure and endurance. Their skin was darkened by sun and wind, their bodies hardened by steep hills and narrow passes. Scripture would later describe them with unforgettable words, faces like lions and feet like gazelles. These were not ornamental soldiers. These were men built for pursuit and survival, warriors whose appearance alone warned enemies to keep their distance. This is not a story about a minor tribe or supporting characters. It is the story of elite fighters who stood with a rejected king before the throne was secure, men whose courage helped establish a kingdom and whose loyalty carried David through his most dangerous years. This is the story of the Gadites.
NOLA Bible Stories.
Their story begins long before David ever fled into the wilderness. The tribe of Gad traces its name back to Jacob's seventh son. When Jacob blessed his children near the end of his life, he spoke prophetic words over Gad, words recorded in Genesis 49:19. Raiders shall raid Gad, but Gad shall raid at their heels. From the beginning, Gad's future was tied to conflict. They would be attacked, pressed, tested, but they would not be defeated. They would strike back. That prophecy shaped their history. After Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, as the nation camped on the plains of Moab, the Gadites prepared to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. But before the crossing, the Gadites made a request that startled the rest of Israel. They looked east of the Jordan and saw land well suited for their vast herds, rolling pasturelands, fertile valleys, room to grow. Their request is recorded in Numbers chapter 32. They asked Moses for permission to settle there. Moses reacted sharply. He had seen what fear could do to a generation. "Shall your brothers go to war while you sit here?" he demanded. "Why do you discourage the heart of Israel?" But the Gadites were not afraid of war. They were preparing for it. They promised to build cities for their families, but to cross the Jordan armed, fighting alongside the other tribes until the land was fully subdued. They would settle early, yes, but they would not abandon the mission. Moses agreed on one condition: they must fulfill their word, and they did. When Israel crossed the Jordan under Joshua, the men of Gad crossed first. They stood at the front of the formation, leading the charge into hostile territory. This is recorded in Joshua 1, verses 12 through 18, and Joshua 4. From the very beginning, the Gadites were not spectators. They were protectors. Their inheritance lay east of the Jordan, in the land of Gilead, described in Joshua 13. It was good land, but it was dangerous land. Without the natural barrier of the river, the Gadites lived exposed. Enemy raids were common, defense was constant, peace was fragile. Living there forged them. Generations passed, and Israel eventually demanded a king. Saul rose and fell.
You have rejected the word of the Lord, but I spared the best to sacrifice to the Lord. Obedience is better than sacrifice.
And when God chose David, a shepherd from Bethlehem, to replace him, the transition was anything but smooth. David was anointed but not enthroned, promised but not protected, hunted but not abandoned. David fled into the wilderness, moving from cave to stronghold, gathering followers who were desperate, indebted, and discontented. To stand with David during these years was to risk everything. and it was during this dangerous season that the Gadites appeared. Their arrival is recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, one of the most detailed accounts of David's supporters. Scripture pauses to describe the Gadites in striking detail, as if to underline their importance. From the Gadites there went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness mighty men of valor, men trained for battle who could handle shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and who were as swift as gazelles on the mountains. 1 Chronicles 12, verse 8. These were not inexperienced volunteers. These were elite warriors, men accustomed to fighting uphill, downhill, at night, and while outnumbered. Their home on the frontier had trained them for exactly this kind of conflict. Then, Scripture adds a detail that reveals their courage even more clearly. They crossed the Jordan River in the first month when it overflowed all its banks. Flood season. The river was wide, fast, and dangerous, but the Gadites did not wait for safety. They crossed anyway, driving away enemies on both the east and west banks as they came. They fought their way to David. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to these lesser-known but powerful stories of Scripture, stories that reveal how God builds His kingdom through faithful, courageous people, this is a great moment to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this, waiting to be uncovered. The Bible tells us that the least of these Gadite warriors was worth 100 men, and the greatest 1,000. This was not exaggeration, it was recognition. Their presence strengthened David's forces, their experience brought discipline, their loyalty brought stability. As David's following grew and his battles multiplied, the Gadites stood with him, against Philistines, against raiders, against internal threats. Their speed allowed them to pursue fleeing enemies. Their strength allowed them to hold critical ground. Their vigilance protected David during his most vulnerable years. They were frontier warriors serving a future king. When David finally became king over all Israel, the Gadites were counted among the men who helped establish his rule. Their loyalty during his exile was not forgotten. Their courage had helped shape the kingdom itself. Yet their story carries both honor and warning. Because the Gadites lived east of the Jordan, they were also among the first to suffer when Israel turned away from God. In 2 Kings 15, verse 29, and 1 Chronicles 5, we learn that the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser invaded the eastern tribes. Gilead fell. The Gadites were taken into exile. The endless frontier they once defended became the path of their captivity. But exile did not erase their legacy. The Gadites are remembered as men who chose duty over ease, loyalty over safety, and faithfulness over reward. They remind us that God often entrusts His most critical victories to those willing to stand where danger is greatest. They stood with David when he had no throne. They fought before the kingdom was secure. They crossed rivers others feared. Faces like lions, feet like gazelles, hearts committed to God's anointed. And through their courage, God established a king and a kingdom that would shape history. Join us next week for another interesting Bible story. God bless you.